Greetings and welcome to In-Depth. I'm Dike Rostant. Economic development implications of the Venezuelan migrant crisis, Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean community is a new publication by Professor Roger Hosein and Doctors Bhoendradatt Tewarie, Rebecca Gookool-Bosland and Anthony Gonzales. Now, it has been described as a valuable and dynamic research contribution to modern-day migration studies with a specific intention of improving policy and practice in the local, regional, and global context. It has also been said that the work's main strength is its timeliness and scope, with a relevance that has legs. Now, we're very happy to have retired principal of the UWI St. Augustine campus and Pro-Vice Chancellor Planning and Development, former Minister of Planning and Sustainable Development, Dr. Bhoendradatt Tewarie, author as well as academic, joining us to discuss it further. Thank you so much for spending the time, Dr. Tewarie. But I want to start off by asking if this publication is an answer or provides an answer, what is the problem statement or what does it look to address?
Well, the problem that it seeks to address is how do you manage an influx of migrants into your country if it happens? And the second thing is there a case for a more managed approach to migration linked to development? And I think the book answers those questions well, not only from the Trinidad and Tobago example, but by looking at what has happened in other parts of the world where we've had crises. Because there's one thing in which, if a country has a planned migration system or policy, let's say like Canada, then you can organize that in a certain way. You organize it by quotas. You are a big country, so you organize it systematically so that you know how many people you're going to get each year, what kind of skills you're going to get, etc. But when you have a situation where the migration has been thrust upon you, like Trinidad and Tobago, you don't have time to plan that. You really have to make some adjustments. You have to do certain things. You have to improvise. Many times government has to organize with other institutions, either local institutions on the ground, as they did here with international organizations resident here from the United Nations, or as they did with the Catholic institutions.
I know there's some people, PMMR.
Yes. So that you do that, but you also organize with international organizations as well. And of course, the government is key in the process because the government has to help to manage and facilitate the process so that you don't have disorder. So the book examines these things, but we also examine, for instance, what has happened in the case of Syria, which provided the world with the largest migration ever seen. We also had a situation in sub-Saharan Africa, which again is another challenge. And very recently we have the situation of Ukraine. But I mean, we look at the Venezuelan migration as a migration that has to do with a country near to us, Venezuela, in which people are coming to Trinidad and Tobago. So you have a big country providing migrants to a small country. And we tend to see it in that. But really, this Venezuelan migration has been the second largest migration in the entire world.
And I'm really glad that you raised the example of Canada. That seems very structured, and that actually kind of hits home. My mom is one of 8, and 4 of them ended up going to Canada.
Yes.
And actually having that jurisdiction advertising for you can come here, these are the people we want, sometimes being a lot easier. So recently I would have heard that there was a family that migrated because they wanted the wife. And they said, we will make a place, we will organize so that everyone comes. So that is one less thing to tether you, to tie you, to make it easier, to facilitate that journey. But you spoke about different places, Ukraine, Syria, Canada. Are there any areas that you find in terms of these global migration patterns that have been kind of similar to what we're experiencing now with regard to the Venezuelan migration?
Well, I think what has, in many ways, what has happened with the Venezuelan has been sudden and swift. It's true it's over 7 years or so, but it has been sudden, swift, and fast. Now, that is in a sense ironic because Venezuela is a place that used to take in migrants. Because, I mean, people would remember Venezuela as a wealthy country because of oil. And secondly, when Colombia had its problems, you had a big migration from Colombia involving literally millions of people whom Venezuela took in. And when you look at the pattern of migration in Venezuela over many years, you see that people from Spain migrate to Venezuela, people from Portugal, people from all over Europe migrate to Venezuela. But that shifted suddenly because of political and economic deterioration. And what you had in Venezuela was a situation in which the authoritarian politics led to economic hardship over time. And therefore you had an exodus of Venezuelans going all over the world. They went to Europe, some of them went to the United States, some of them to Canada, but most of the migration took place in developing countries. Colombia got some, Panama got some, Costa Rica got some, and in the Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago got some, Curacao got some, Guyana got some, less in some of the other islands like Barbados, St. Kitts, etc. And from the Caribbean point of view, our situation is that we never had a Caribbean CARICOM policy or some kind of rational approach to it. And in Trinidad and Tobago, we had to make an adjustment to the numbers at some point when we started to register migrants. And it is very uncertain now what the numbers are. We have an official number, which is about 20,000 or less. But we also have an unofficial number, which could be 30,000, 40,000 or whatever.
And the way we get to that certainty, the way we deal with some of those numbers and look at the data is what we're going to discuss when we return from the break. Stay with us. We're speaking with Dr. Bhoe Tewarie, and we're looking at the economic development implications of the Venezuelan migrant crisis. We return with more. Welcome back. We are speaking with Dr. Bhoe Tewarie, looking at development implications of the Venezuelan migrant crisis. And how have you come about, or the authors of the book, looked at the data sets in terms of where have you gotten figures from? What is that process like?
Oh, well, a lot of the work, a lot of the information we got from international sources. The UN has an important stack of data, and this immigration question in the Western Hemisphere has been something that they have been monitoring. So we got a lot of the information from IMO and related institutions. Some of the data came from CARICOM, based on the CARICOM countries. A lot of the data came from think tanks that have been doing research on this matter. And the data for Trinidad and Tobago, we could only go on the basis of the information from the government of Trinidad and Tobago, information from Living Water, information from the UN here in terms of the
UNCHR, I believe.
UNHCR, that's right. They provided a lot of data. And so we try to make sense of all of that in context, including speculative arguments based on what people were sensing were different from the available data. So we basically try to give a very truthful, honest, objective assessment of what was happening. And we got data worldwide, we got from the UN system. There's a lot of data on migration from Syria, from sub-Saharan Africa, Afghanistan, other places in which these have been a problem. And because the Venezuelan migration issue became such a big one, as I said, it was the second largest after the crisis in Syria, the world took notice, and there was a fair amount of data. So it was really an amalgamation of local, regional, and international sources.
And I like the fact that you talk about local, regional, and international. We're going to get to that in just a bit. But there's one thing to have all the data, or so much data, that you are deciding on how to use it. Speak to me about the methodologies, because Hosein, Gonzales, Tewarie, Gookool-Bosland, coming from different aspects or different specialization, different fields, how do you decide this is how we're going to look at this data? This is how we're going to present that data?
Yes. Okay. Very good. Oh, you want me to respond?
Please.
Sorry.
How we deal with that?
I thought you were going on a break.
No, man.
No, what happened is that, so basically the way we approach this book is that we talked about what we were going to write about and how we were going to approach the work for almost a year. Meanwhile, each of us was thinking and writing. And at some point during the course of that year, later in the period, we divided up the work and focused on what each person would focus on. So the first chapter of the book, for instance, deal with the whole business of the fact that the migration to the New World had created the conditions in which one of the characteristics of the New World, the Americas, was that all of the societies had been established by either voluntary or forced migration. So you had the imperialists, you had people enslaved coming from Africa, you had the settled Amerindians who lived here before. Subsequent to that, you had indenture under the British system, etc. And you had massive migration in the 19th century across to the Western Hemisphere. So the pattern of migration, this Western Hemisphere, is really a region of the world in which the only settled population was the Amerindian population. Everybody else was an immigrant of some kind. So that set the tone for that. And we talked about the characteristics of the Western Hemisphere. There has also been a lot of internal migration across borders and so on. And the other chapters trace the problems in Venezuela and how that emerged as a problem, how it is evolved, and what has happened with the pattern of migration. Then what happened is that there are 4 economic chapters that look at the impact of migration, not in terms of the Venezuelan, in terms of what has happened elsewhere. All right, so Cubans migrating to the United States and how that has been managed, how it has handled, what have been the results. Vietnamese migrating to different parts of the world, particularly the United States, how that has happened, what difference it made, Koreans, etc. So what was done in those cases is the economic results of migration in each case were assessed on the basis of data to find out, well, do they lower the price of wages when they move into a country? Do they become entrepreneurs? Do they generate business? Do they become valuable members of the society? Do they bring with them a kind of social capital as a community that makes a difference? And all of these things were examined in the context of what might be possible with Venezuelan migration in the Caribbean. And then the final chapter of the book really makes a case for what you might call a free economic and zone of peace and prosperity in the Americas. Because I don't know if you are aware of this, but the Americas as a region constitute that part of the world in which the greatest inequality exists. When I found that during the course of the research, I was very surprised.
In terms of that surprise, though, we have about 2 minutes. And looking at, sometimes I think that in Trinidad and Tobago, well, at least in times gone a little bit, there was this feeling that everybody jealous us and everybody wants to come to Trinidad and Tobago.
Yes.
So we shouldn't necessarily have them. So what would you tell to the person in these 2 minutes that we have? How should we look at this migrant? How should we look at it and be able to glean positives from it that take us forward? And because the start of the book, of the title, speaks about an economic. So in terms of like those implications, where is the positive?
Well, and there are many, many positives. I think the first thing is we have to decide in the Western Hemisphere whether we are going to continue as a zone of inequality, of rabid inequality. And I think the answer to that must be no. And the only way to solve that is with trade, investment, development, financial flows, etc., but also the movement of people. So that when you are setting out an economic strategy for the hemisphere in which the various countries are involved, the inequality question must come up and the development question must come up. That must also be true to Trinidad and Tobago. So in Trinidad and Tobago, we have to have a development strategy for Trinidad and Tobago. How much people do we need to achieve a per capita income of X over how many years, and what are the skills that we require of these people? And how do we get them partially by migration and partially by education at home? And I think those kinds of strategies could make a country very prosperous, could make a country very, very poignant in terms of its own development achievements. And both for the hemisphere and for Trinidad and Tobago, the question is, how do you have a system of shared prosperity that would make the necessity of migration less? Because wherever people are, they are earning a decent opportunity and a good income and lifestyle.
And that question and that could that you said is so important. And people talk about shoulda, woulda, coulda, if, but at the same time, I tell people that the best teachers that I've had, they've left me wanting more, and this is the case. So thank you very much, Dr. Tewarie. Thank you. Looking at the economic development implications of the Venezuelan migrant crisis, speaking with Dr. Bhoendradatt Tewarie. And this has been In Depth with me, Dike Rostant, on behalf of the entire TTT News team. Thank you so much for joining us.